I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. In this, the second of a special series, we talk with Jack Adam Weber about what's possible while facing collapse of Earth and human systems. In this special series of Poetry of Predicament, we explore the immense possibilities available if we take on practices of reconnection with the web of life, with Jack Adam Weber. All right, welcome everybody. We are back. Jack and Dean are back on a very special series of Poetry of Predicament podcasts. And particularly, this is meant to be a series for people who are really at an advanced stage of inner preparation for which has recently been called deep adaptation, in preparation for more and more existential level stressors in our lives, globally and individually. And last time we had a lot, excuse me, a lot of ground to cover, and we talked about what got us into this place, and talked about that it was, for my jargon, it all turned out to be one version or another of our disconnection from our primary sources of meaning in life, the deeper self, others, and Earth. And we did speak, both of us, mostly me, in pretty linear terms. We filled a lot of lecture-y, covering the distinctions, laying out a lot of the terminology that we're going to be using in this series. And I think that's going to be the most that this series is going to sound like that. So thank you all for your patience in that first session. And this time we're going to take one of those disconnections, the disconnection from deeper self. And Jack and I are just going to do what we often do, and what really got us to making this series happen, which is, we just so enjoyed each other and ourselves at the end of any call. We just found ourselves lit up and excited and creating at a new level and so on. And we just decided we got to share this. This is good stuff, just experientially, if not for the content itself. And so that's why we're doing it. And I think, again, as we get into this series, you're going to get more and more larger doses of that energy that Jack and I find so engaging. And we're going to start where the sacred teachings of ancient teachings of spiritual traditions so often started, which is our relationship with our deeper self. And so what I'm hoping that we're going to do is Jack will tour us around some of his internal mapping of what it's like to be Jack Adam Weber in his life and his circumstances and his practices. And I'll do my best to do the same, share some of that. And what we often found and find in these conversations is that there's a way that we both, in just sharing about our experience, we become more enlivened just by sharing that experience. So instead of talking about it some more, I'd like to ask you, Jack, to start us out with one of a number of poems that you shared with me just before we started recording. Man, you've got some serious mojo going on with the quotes today. So share one of those. And
yeah, you called it poetry, and they're not poems, they're quotes, but it is poetry. So
yeah. Yeah, I consider it so. So, hi, welcome here, and how you doing? And what's the quote you got?
Okay. I was already taking notes just while you were beginning to speak. It's like, got my notepad out again. All right, so this is a quote. Actually, I have it in my book. It's from a video by Marion Woodman. I can't remember which one it is, but Mary Woodman is sort of one of Jung's proteges, depth psychologist. So she's talking about the shadow and darkness and projection, and she says, because we reject our own humanity, because we reject our own humanity, we reject what Jung calls the shadow side. We've pushed that down into the unconscious. And the minute we do that, we start projecting it out onto someone else so that someone else has to carry our so-called darkness. What I'm suggesting is that we have to now begin to own our own darkness.
Yeah. Yeah, that's just brilliant. I so thank you for sharing that with us, and for going right to one of the most important, I would call it a membrane of resistance in our culture and often individually, is to really tell the truth about the human dynamic, the inner human dynamic, especially when we're so deeply addicted to a fossil fuel driven extravaganza as we are.
Mhm.
And we're hitting the end of that fossil fuel driven extravaganza one way or another. And so the demand is really for us to become truthful and self-aware
Yeah.
at a level that's never been called for before. So is there anything that you'd like to say after?
Hold on one sec. I'm getting okay. Telemarketer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight, I mean, besides the obvious terms of shadow and darkness that are in Marion's quote, I want to highlight the humanity part. You and I had talked about this before. And so she says that, you know, it's because we reject our humanity that we sort of build, you know, this big pain shadow pressure on ourselves. And so I just want to highlight the word humanity, which is our humanness. And that's my spirituality. It's just becoming fully, robustly, skillfully, and wisely human. And I think that that's poignant for our discussion today.
Yeah. I thank you for that. And I just previews of coming attractions in terms of what I plan on sharing today is in the name of that humanness that you're talking about. You know, as I'm now in probably the fourth major wave of doing shadow work in my life.
Hmm.
And what with each wave, I've had to find more and more of that humanity that you're pointing at and that she was pointing at in the quote. That there's, when I was young in the study and the revelation of myself, I was quick to judge myself, my shadow, other people's shadow, it all. That's I guess often a younger man, especially male tendency, is to kind of project in the even in the middle of working on a shadow, which is built on projection. And so as with each of these major waves of doing this shadow inner work, especially with this last one, it's really been a challenge to find a deeper and deeper compassion and a deeper experience of our shared humanity,
Yeah.
including our shadow.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate appreciate you bringing that up. Is there
Yeah.
more you'd like
Yeah.
to say
Yeah.
about?
I mean, it's like you start talking and I'm just scribbling. So, you know, I want to mention something. I don't know if you'll agree with this or not, and of course that's fine. But something that I've noticed about shadow work in my time is there tends to be, in our last session, we brought up this notion of binary thinking, right? And its dangers. And I think it's also important to point out a kind of binism that comes up in shadow work. And typically like in the New Age movement and, people sort of just beginning shadow work, we sort of view that there's this sort of meme or belief that that there's nothing that's bad on the outside. There's nothing that's truly evil. There's nothing that's truly wrong with the world. And as long as we resolve our inner selves and take care of our own blind spots and darkness, then the outer world will just sort of magically change. And I just want to call that out. And I don't find truth in that. I think I find that it's a dangerous belief.
Mhm.
And so in shadow work, it's really important to do our own work and uncover our own blind spots, and that changes how we interface with the world. I think that two things can happen. One is that it's simultaneously, it's important to also call out what's happening in the world and to stand up for justice and to stand up for equality and to stand up for truly evil and destructive, what I call unfertile darkness, right? Darkness that doesn't really have much of a remunerative value. It's what Marion Woodman calls a death wish. So, so just to highlight that as we work on ourselves, it doesn't mean that we just retreat into ourselves and it becomes this whole like self-obsessive thing. Not at all. For me, shadow work and emotional work is to free ourselves up so that we can integrate ourselves, so that we can become medicine in the world, so that we can become potent and effective. And we end up doing so much more effectively because we have an integration, because we can work with other people, and because emotions and critical thinking, which to me are both work hand in hand ideally in any kind of inner work, that those things help us see the world and see the world honestly and see what's happening and to call it out, and to have that sensitivity, something we brought up last time also, to notice, I notice when I'm projecting because a little quiet alarm will go off in my head or in my body, and I'll say, hold on, Jack, or, this isn't true, or, and then hopefully often I'll pause or I'll reflect upon it later. I'll make amends if necessary. But I think that becoming sensitive in ourselves, and when the more work we do on ourselves, for me, it's built a real sensitivity so that I can recognize what my body's telling me, what I call body truth. And so that when I'm engaging in the world, I'm still connected to that body truth. And it'll tell me, it's my gauge for the truth that I'm speaking, or the truths that I'm not speaking. And it's also a gauge for, like a bullshit meter in other people and information that I hear. And of course that requires further investigation to discern, what's true or not, to be a skeptic to my own projections and beliefs. So just give me one sec, Dean. I want to say that. And yeah, so the other thing I want to mention is in this aspect of humanity. So if we're saying what's important is that we embrace our humanity, and I feel that that is our challenge these days, is to embrace our humanity. It means that we have to embrace all the shitty parts of what being human is. And I think that's why a lot of us have and do reject our humanity, because we don't know how to handle the difficult feelings. So shadow work for me is also shadow emotional work. So identifying the emotions we have difficulty expressing or accepting in others, and and the pain, the emotional pain shadow that we've carried through trauma through our lives. And the more we get to unfurl that and release some of that back pressure, I feel the more human we can be. The more human we can be, the more honest we can be, right? So we can't be honest if we have a fear of how whatever honesty we acknowledge will make us feel. So I just see a continuum there between external and internal. And this aspect of being human and being honest is so important. And that's the last little note I have, is that being honest, not only there's emotional honesty and then there's intellectual honesty. And we need both of those in spades these days. We need especially the intellectual honesty to acknowledge the facts in the world, the facts of climate change, the facts of climate emergency. And to be intellectually honest about that, we also have to be emotionally honest, because it's going to make us feel distressed or angry and sad and despairing and whatever it is. So just wanted to give a little intro to how that's all wrapped up in the same kind of wholeness for me.
Thank you. I'd like to just call in another dimension of certainly of the possible audience for this podcast. Because we're talking about ourselves, and we're talking about folks in talking about you and me. We're talking about folks who consider ourselves to be accepting and aware of our predicament, of the collapsing nature of numerous human and earth systems. And what I've noticed is that there is no less shadow. There's really not much wisdom, and there's not much in terms of other kinds of payoff, just because someone like you or me or any of the folks that might be watching, that we accept, that we have taken it on to become as fully aware of what's actually going on as possible, and then become collapse aware and be engaged in whatever way is true for us that way. That's not a guarantee of any kind of enlightenment, just because we have taken on that particular track for our consciousness, for our awareness. And I'm saying that because I've just, in myself, I've seen shadow tracks here, and in many of the people in the circles that I'm a part of, in terms of folks who lead podcasts, much like the one that I lead, and they're actually far more engaged in presenting day after day, hour after hour, more and more evidence of how things are collapsing and how bad things are and how quickly it's going to hell. And I'm noticing in myself that I have very little patience for that in myself and in other people now. I still listen to their podcasts. I still include the occasional sober data. But what
Dane, sorry, you have little patience for what?
I have little patience for the endless listing of evidence of how things are collapsing and it's accelerating, and then we're really screwed now. No, we're really, really screwed now, and so on. And what I'm really calling us out, what I'm wanting to do right now is call us all out at a new level, because you use the word truth quite a bit in what you just said.
Honesty.
What I'm really kind of leaning toward is some of the work that I've had the privilege of being around and partially exposed to and participated in. I am not in the AA program, but I've been around it an awful lot in Al-Anon and with my own family members and friends. And I have a deep respect for the 12 steps, because there's a lot that really seems to work for a lot of people in there. And it starts out with really just a letting go of control. And behind that is a commitment to deep honesty. I think it's the same kind of honesty you were just talking about. And I think that there's really a lack of that, even in these very well-meaning members of the doomosphere, if you will. People who are collapse aware and they're engaged in stacking up the evidence and repeating it and so on. And so I just want to mention that as one subgroup that I believe I want to include in our conversations, because the shadow is just as present, if not more so. You know what I'm really also getting at is I don't think these are discretionary practices anymore. You know, for anybody who's engaged, even at a very basic level of being collapse aware in this world, there's really, again, this is my judgment and my point of view and whatever, but if we have even a minimal engagement with the truth at the existential level, we are leaders. Just by having that awareness, even a kernel of that awareness, we have a moral obligation to be leaders.
Just by being able to admit it.
Just by being willing to pierce through that first layer,
Mm-hmm.
and to be able to say, we are in collapse.
Mm-hmm.
It is unraveling now, and we are in it, and we're causing it. So let me just stop there. I'm sure point made, and I'm not saying it to now make them wrong or me wrong in my podcast or anything like that. It's just, I want to include those of us who might think we've got some special stuff going on just because we've made that piercing move into the first layer.
Mm-hmm.
You know, really what it calls for is the practices that I shared in, I believe it was the last session of you and me talking. I had my own Marion Woodman quote to offer about practices, and that anyone who's at this level of awareness.
The tutu.
Yeah, right.
The tutu quote.
Yeah, yeah. That it's just as insane to approach this whole existential predicament without practices as it is to run naked into a forest fire dressed only in a paper tutu. So let's talk about some of those practices, some of the challenges of what it is to reconnect with deeper self. Where do you want to go?
You know, I just want to start just on my end. You know, I'm still like in this orientation of honesty and emotional honesty, and I have the word humility written down here, which I didn't have before. And I just want to say that for myself, you know, going through shadow work and shadow pain work has humbled me. And I think there's a meme in the world, especially in spiritual circles, you know, to be humble, to be humble, to be humble. And I like to look at, let's engage in the things that humble us. And to me, that's what really makes us humble. It's like with compassion, it's like be compassionate, be compassionate, be compassionate. How about engaging in the activities and the work that make us compassionate, right? And for me, being humbled is like when you're knocked down and when you grieve and when you're terrified and when you need other people's help and when you can't sleep at night. You know, these things to me are humbling, and to me that's what makes us humble rather than this kind of superficial overlay on humility. And the word humility comes from the old root humus, which is earth. And so becoming human is becoming earth. And there's human, and I didn't even realize it until I just said it, but human, humility, and the humus of earth. And as we're humbled and as we become more human, especially through emotional honesty, we become more earth centric. And that's where I feel that, you know, the inner work really delivers us. And I think that that speaks to this disconnect, which you know, have as one of your pillars of when we're disconnected from ourselves, we're disconnected from everything. And if you want to jump into that, that was one of the red notes that you made in a, you know, in our brief outline. If you want to jump into that right now, it'd probably be right on target.
You know, let me just peruse the notes that you so beautifully put together before this, because I want to be sure we, you know, I'd like to see us stay in as best we can in one of the realms for each talks. These, you know, deeper self or right relationship with others, or reconnection with Earth.
That's fine.
And that doesn't mean we can't jump around, but let me just make sure we've covered some good stuff here, and all the good stuff that you made notes of. Um,
Thanks for doing that.
you know, I don't mean to be repetitive, and I certainly don't mean to be condescending to anyone in the audience, or certainly or to you. But I want to just repeat the kind of simple layout that I started last time. Just want to kind of cover those steps again,
Okay.
so that people can know where I'm coming from, and I believe pretty much where you're coming from as well, which is what got us here into this predicament is that we've disconnected from the primary sources of meaning in a human life: deeper self, others, and earth. And by doing that, both individually and collectively, we have these massive blind spots in core areas of our presence and our ability to be present in the world. So when you and I are talking about reconnection and practices that will help us reconnect within any of these realms, we're literally talking about rebuilding our ability to be present to the world, and also our ability to be authentically presenced in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And without it, we're actually less human. We're humans with massive chunks that we have forfeited out of our system.
Yeah. And I want to add to that, Dean, that I think that when we're chunked out like that inside, right? When we're chunked out and missing and voidful, you know, we create institutions and we create social structures that reflect that. And then those reinforce our disconnect. So it becomes a vicious positive feedback loop of dysfunction and separation.
Right.
Yeah. And how about this, Dean? Say, because when you're talking, how about if I want to chime in, I just go like this or something like that, and then you know that I have something to chime in.
Yep.
And then whenever it's comfortable for you, and vice versa, so we can kind of keep this fluid, and we can, you know, so they're not big gaps. All right, cool. And can I say one other thing right now?
Please, yeah, go.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you just mentioned something that came up before too, and I wrote a little note about it in terms of the tools and the practices. And I want to differentiate again between branch and root practice. And I think, and it sort of has to do with, like, I think there are instances where if we don't feel humble, that we can muster humility, and when we don't feel compassionate, we can muster compassion, right? We can be stressed out, or, you know, whatever's going on. And so we want to deal with the root, but there are times that we have to just, you know, act as if. And in this respect, with practices, certainly for myself in regulating my own emotions, especially anxiety, anger, there are things that I do in the moment if I find myself triggered, or if I find myself, you know, out of balance or not contributing to the greater good in a situation. And so in terms of the practices for me, like the root practices are like grief work and shadow work and things that I've engaged in for years, for decades, and that those build a kind of person that's integrated, right? And those are not things that we can like do overnight, and then all of a sudden we've like done our shadow work, and we can like be this different kind of person in the world. So and when push comes to shove in the moment, there are certain practices that we can do in the moment to help regulate ourselves in that moment. But I think that deep transformation that you and I both speak to, this kind of comprehensive transformation, is something that you began or have been engaged with and then just keep carrying on with, and it builds over time. And then if you're living well and successful in these things, then you end up being a person of more integrity.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. That's a wonderful spot to just really drive home the cost of the disconnection with deeper self at its core, we are unable to generate authentic integrity if we are disconnected from deeper self. Just by definition,
Right. By
that's where
definition.
integrity lives. That's where it's visible in contrast to the outer world.
Mhm.
So thank you. Yeah, it's great. And I'd like to just jump for a moment to just kind of perhaps the bright side, if you can tolerate some brightness for a moment. um, I just really want to acknowledge there's some serious brilliance going on with a few of the leading edge activist organizations that are going on right now, as of last year, really. And I'm thinking particularly, and not exclusively, but particularly easy to see in Extinction Rebellion and how they're putting it together. And how they're putting it together is, I think, entirely consistent with this conversation you and I are having. They're taking on human beings as a wholeness and how we have lost aspects of ourselves. They wouldn't use exactly the same words, but I believe that they're talking about exactly the same kind of weak suits, strong suits that people bring from just general public. And what they're trying to do is create something that is essentially as empowering as they possibly can, including some of the things that you've just been talking about, like telling the truth at an extraordinarily deep level. And that's part of what they're then demanding or requesting from the government and
Powers that be.
the
Yeah.
protesting about. I noticed you raised a finger, so.
Yeah, we're having our Extinction Rebellion meeting tonight. I think it's our fourth or fifth one, so we're getting that going here in Ojai and hopefully in neighboring cities. And it brings up an important point, and in going over the principles and the demands and the operating policies of Extinction Rebellion, I really appreciate that it's not just rebellion, right? It's not just this Occupy thing.
Mhm.
And I spoke to this psychiatrist that lives in our community who wants to be part of it, and he says he works with Bill Plotkin's work, and he said that, oh well, both Bill and I, we think it's unfortunate that Extinction Rebellion is primarily just like the rebel archetype. And I said, well, actually, it's not just the rebel archetype. That if you look at the operating principles, there's a regenerative arm that's really strong with Extinction Rebellion. And in my worldview of yin and yang, like, I love that, because the more integrated it is with yin and yang, then to me that's a sign of true resiliency and wholeness and comprehension.
Yeah.
And so it's saying, it does the yang, the fierce hand, that's the rebellion that says no more emissions, net zero emissions by 2025, no more corporate greed, no more corporate corruption, lots of things that are part of the problem. And then the yin aspect is the regenerative aspect that says, that sort of they leave it up to individual Extinction XR groups to come up with whatever is appropriate in that particular environment. So we're super excited about that. We're going to be hopefully planting a food forest here. We're working on networking with community, because we live in a small town, networking with food sharing and being there for one another, and survival skills, creativity. We're working with creativity groups, and also we're going to create positive demonstrations. So we're not only going to have die-ins and all the gory kind of stuff, but we're going to have really uplifting things, like someone brought up singing songs, like positive, affirming, earth-centered, collaborative, conjoining songs and artwork and poetry. So I think that's a really awesome thing that Extinction Rebellion has sort of created a template, with a certain overlay, but then also left it up to individual groups to figure out what works in their communities, working with both yin and yang, because you can't just say no to everything if you don't really have a solution. And so, they have solutions too, and they inspire us to come up with solutions.
There we go. I so look forward to being a part of whatever will end up being sparked in my Southern Oregon Rogue Valley location. We're pretty slow to get that level of participation that you're describing there, and certainly
You're the man.
nowhere near what they've got in the UK.
Yeah.
So that was a good little visit to the bright side. And
Yeah.
I want to, yeah, go ahead.
And just a lot, I said when you were saying about Southern Oregon, I said, you're the man. I charge you to start that up there.
Well, I'm clear, and I know that that's what it's going to end up being. I know that, yeah,
Okay.
but I appreciate it.
Yeah. And on the bright side, I wanted to say that, in my writing, I call it, in my discussions, I call it the love we already have in hand. So as we do dark work and shadow work, right, it's like, okay, well, where's the yang part of that, right? That's the yin, kind of dark hidden. The yang part of that is the light of our awareness, the support that we have, and the care and passion that we have, so that as we interface with ourselves, right, we do that in a dialectic, otherwise we're caught inside it. So to do shadow work, to do pain work, for myself anyway, and I think for most people, there's, our psyche has to be split and integrated at the same time, so that we can work lovingly and caringly with ourselves, right, and create a container for ourselves for this material to come up and to work. So I just wanted to bring up that the light is just as important as the darkness. It's absolutely necessary.
Yeah, I thought it was done with Extinction Rebellion talking at the moment, but I want to add, I've listened to a few interviews with some of the founding members, and I've rarely been so inspired by how much love that they have for their communities, for especially all the other Extinction Rebellion volunteers and people who are showing up as activists. They're fully including the notion of grieving together. In other words, ways of self-regulating, not only individually but collectively, and they're doing that in addition to the nurturing that they're bringing to each other. They're setting up full-on resting times after a time of particular heated engagement. They're giving themselves lots of rest, and they're really taking care of one another in terms of the legalities, getting people out of jail, and on and on. So I guess that puts a bell on it for me. It's just there is extraordinary activism going on, activism of the heart and of the spirit. So yeah. I want to get back, where I would tend to go right now is just to revisiting this thing about how does addiction fit in here, and does it fit in that shadow dynamic we were talking about? Do you have a particular direction that you'd like to go? Because I'd be happy to go where you want to go as well.
Yeah, I'll just throw out a cue that the main thing that comes up for me with addiction is, well, first of all, there are lots of kinds of addiction, and then there are lots of causes for addiction. Some people have different brains and different neurochemistry and different genetics that predispose us to addiction of all kinds. Mm-hmm. And I think there's another kind of addiction that we can address that I think is really pertinent to what we're discussing. That's not sort of the purely biological predisposition, but the one of denial. So addiction being a form of denial that, and I say that with compassion as well, because some things are overwhelming in life, and some things we're not equipped to handle, and some things we don't have the support, personally or interpersonally or financially, to handle. And so establishing that it's not a judgmental discussion and view of this. And at the same time, there's a lot that we can do to help overcome our addictions, and that overcoming addiction, in my view, I haven't really had addictive tendencies, thankfully, but I know and have worked closely with people that have. And I think there are ways to, again, come back to our humanness and find the support, and the triangle of resiliency relationships that we've discussed, I think, are crucial to help bring us out of addiction, and to identify the emotions and the pain and the trauma that's under a lot of addictive tendencies when they're taken on as a way of being overwhelmed and not being able to regulate what's actually primarily happened.
Mm-hmm.
And I do have that quote by Gabor Mate that I mentioned before. I guess it's just coming to mind. I don't have to read it right now, but
I wish you would.
okay, all right. Why don't you just chime into what I said, and I'll bring that up. I have to just search for it quickly.
Really, where I was going, excuse me, where I was going with the request to cover a bit more of the addiction topic was, it seems to me to be ridiculously obvious that we are in a shadow-driven human operating system around the globe right now, that those in power are, and for the vast majority of us not in power, but following right along, because of our addiction to this fossil fuel driven extravaganza that we've had the privilege of being born into. We have deep addictive trends in us, and we have no choice but to have massive expression of shadow, and not to mention undigested, unmetabolized grief. And I believe that these all add up to an extraordinarily unconscious and now fairly obviously ecocidal presence on the planet.
Yeah.
So I'll just stop there, because that's sort of why I wanted to talk about it some more. But do you have your quote?
Yeah, I do have the quote, and I just want to mention one little quick thing in relation to what you said. Is there's another meme that and belief that goes around, our addiction to fossil fuel, and I feel that it's better to describe that, or I feel it's more accurate, not to ascribe it to a fossil fuel addiction, but to the benefits that fossil fuels provide. So it's an addiction to the comforts and an addiction to the conveniences of fossil fuels, because I think we'd all agree that if we could produce those same comforts and conveniences without fossil fuels, no one would be craving fossil fuels. So
yeah, but we don't have that. We don't have any
right, we don't have that.
replacement,
Yeah.
period.
But I think it also highlights that when you call it an addiction to the comforts and conveniences of fossil fuels, that it shines a light on our emotional resiliency to be able to do without some of those things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because they're conveniences.
Yeah.
All right, so Gabor Mate, this is a quote from my book. So he's talking about addiction and emptiness. He says, so the first question in dealing, so Gabor Mate, for those of you who don't know, is a medical doctor, and he's an addiction expert. And he has a real psychological bent to a lot of his work. So he says, so the first question in dealing with addiction is always not why the addiction, but why the pain. So the first question in dealing with addiction is always not why the addiction, but why the pain. I don't have a single FEMA patient in the downtown East Side who was not sexually abused as a child. I've talked to hundreds. Many of them were abused, many sexually, if not sexually, then physically in other ways, or emotionally abandoned, neglected, and hurt. So that's speaking to the traumas we've talked about. Not to mention, of course, that we live in a society that devalues human beings in favor of commodifying everything and everybody, in which people are made to feel insecure, in which people are made to feel they are inadequate, in which they are made to feel that they have to complete themselves from the outside. In other words, we live in a society that itself, in its very nature, is highly addictive. The very idea of the pursuit of happiness. How can you pursue happiness as if it were something outside of you? That includes that induces an emptiness, induces a craving for something to be completing you from the outside. In this society, what do we expect? That many people will turn to addictions to soothe their pain, to soothe their emptiness, to somehow fill the spiritual void in their lives. Gabor Mate. So I think he touches on a lot of really important topics there. And I just want to highlight that I disagree with one aspect of this, is that it's binary, and that we do need things from the outside to help complete us. We need each other. And Dean, that's one of, yours and my pillars of resilience.
Yeah.
So it speaks to a lot of truth, but also that, in a modicum, we do need things from the outside. But I think what he's talking about is the superficial American sort of mercenary pursuit of outer riches, and as a surrogate for inner richness.
Yeah, great. I'd like to just tack on one bit of amplification to what you're just saying right there at the very end. So it's our immersion in the business as usual human operating system. And I want to introduce words that will be familiar to everybody who's watching this, which is just our predatory capitalist system, and emphasis on the predatory. And what I'd like to assert is that we have, all of us, elements of that predatory nature of what capitalism has become in the past 100 years, in this ramp up of the fossil fuel drive, and then other elements as well that have so promoted the shadow side. What we've ended up with is a truly predatory situation, really at the far extreme end of our isolation from one another, our disconnection from one another.
Yeah.
So I agree with you, and appreciate you bringing up about Gabor Mate seemingly leaving out that part of how we so need each other.
Yeah, and the natural world. And when you speak of predatory, I think about that unbalanced aggression, and Marion Woodman's bringing up the shadow in us, and how it creates a death wish, right?
Mm-hmm.
That when we ignore our shadow, we create death on the outside.
Yep.
So when we don't embrace darkness, we create darkness. And that's sort of, to me, the overlying motif of what's going on right now between humans and nature and climate crisis.
Yeah. So, Mike, I'm noticing that it seems like we're kind of coming up on the last quarter of this particular episode of this conversation. And what I'd like to ask us both to do is to share a little bit of our own experience and history and practices that have shed some light for us in this process of reconnecting with deeper self. So unless there's any other topic that you'd like to put a few minutes on, I'd like to head there.
All right. Take a look at that list real quick. I think you have it real handy. Just do a little scan on it and see if anything else jumps out at you. And I'm happy to go wherever you want.
Mm-hmm. Well, something that unfortunately, I don't think we covered very well. What I think we ought to do is just have a later session, perhaps later in July. Have a session in which we talk about self-regulation and what it is to be dysregulated, what it is to be able to articulate and map out our own personal inner dynamics, psychological, psychospiritual dynamics, and really be able to look at. I want to harken back to a quote that I tried to dredge up from Joe Brewer in the first episode of us talking, in which he was asked, so what is a person who sincerely wants to face these trying times, what does the person need at their center? What's most important? And he said, a person needs advanced self-regulation skills and a flexible psychology.
Yeah.
And again, this is last time, bear with me, I'm going to do a little repeat.
Yeah.
My interpretation of what he means by that is our ability to untangle ourselves from an identification with our personality, the personality which is encased in the business as usual human operating system.
Yeah.
And I believe that what he's talking about in that flexibility is the ability to reclaim our center, or in other words, reconnect with deeper self, others, and earth, and in so doing, reassemble a true, authentic center in our experience from which we can live authentically moment by moment, or have a better chance of doing that.
Yeah. I just want to chime in that I don't know exactly what he means by that. I have a sense, but I just, in case he doesn't mean
Yeah,
that genuinely feeling angry or genuinely feeling despaired, that those to me are being in our center, right?
oh,
And
yeah,
I think there's a balance too. Like we can go overboard where anger kind of feeds upon itself, and despair feeds upon itself, and grief wallows in itself a little bit too much sometimes, and depression as well,
right.
especially. So I want to say that, and then I just want to highlight the word that you said at first in Joe Brewer's term is advanced, was preparation skills. You know, the advanced part, that's what I was
Self-regulation.
that's what I was talking about before, that this isn't like you start doing this and then you're ready to go in the next day. That, you know, a lot of this work starts years, if not decades before, and it builds you into this person who is a resilient person, who does have those advanced preparation skills, right? And 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 then is, I think, more able to disentangle or separate, you know, shadow projection and things that are triggered inside from things happening in the world, and vice versa. And a last note on that is that while things are still relatively stable in our world and not totally gone to shit, you know, the reason I'm talking about this, the reason that I promote emotional work and kind of this whole internal dynamic is like, now is this golden time. Now's a golden time to rebel and to try to change things around to the degree that we can. Now's the time to get to inner work. Now's the time to start building community. Now's the time to restore our relationship with nature and the things that are meaningful to us.
Mhm.
I mean, now is the time. This is like, you know, this might be the last little bit of honeymoon that we have left of humanity and civilization to do a lot of things. And at the very least, doing this kind of emotional work. So, Dean, if you will allow me, I just stumbled upon it. I have this little list that I had from before, which is like the key benefits of doing emotional work and doing especially emotional shadow work. Can I just read that off real quick? Because
I think that's wonderful, Jack. I feel free to read that off and then put as
okay,
much context as you want on it, and then we'll just wrap this session, knowing full well that we'll revisit the whole notion of personal practices, and actually group practices as well, in terms of self-regulation and also expansion of capacity to be present in the face of stressors. So go with your list, put it in context for us, and we'll wrap.
okay, well, it'll be quick.
Yeah.
So it's in the context. I'd introduced Rumi's poem, which I'm sure you know, Dean. A lot of listeners probably know, the Guest House, where
Mhm.
Rumi talks about welcoming all of our emotions into the guest house of our hearts, and to sit down and to have tea with them. And anyway, so it's just embracing our difficult emotions. So I say the advantages of welcoming these difficult emotions from our inner and outer lives to the proverbial guest house of our hearts, therefore, are many. They help us, and I have a list of how embracing difficult emotions and feeling badly help us. So the first one is they help us resolve our backlogged emotional pain, especially from childhood. The second is they help us confront and manage difficult emotions such as grief, fear, hopelessness, and anger arising from climate chaos. The third is they help us overcome denial to face the difficult climate change news and reports, right? Because when we pay attention to those reports, they cause us to feel a certain way. And if we are friends with grief and anger and outrage and despair to some degree, then we can more acknowledge what's happening in the world, and we can hear and see those reports. The fourth is they help us cope and thrive with less outward stuff. In my book, I discuss the importance of grief, that there's a secret schooling of grief, which when you go into grief, you learn to do without. And so I think when you learn to thrive with very little, because when you're grieving, you don't want to go out and accumulate a bunch of stuff and do a bunch of things. You just kind of, everything gets pared away, and you're like a, bare tree in late autumn. And so it befriending grief helps us lessen our carbon footprint. Number 5, these dark emotions help us become more emotionally open and vulnerable, increasing our intimacy with and support of one another and the natural world. They help us feel the oneness of all creation and a compassion for all of life. They allow us to live more fully in the present. And the last one, they help us tend to what is ailing without moving away. They help us tend to what's ailing without moving away, thereby preserving our capacity to love in the midst of what's declining. So they help us stay connected to love, because if love only means the positive light side of life, well, when things go to shit, we might find ourselves without love. But if you can embrace this stuff, then you stay there with it.
Beautiful.
That's
Beautiful.
what I got.
Which reminds me, Jack, send me a manuscript, man. I'd be
Oh
happy.
yeah, it's on my mind. I have to turn it in tomorrow. So I wanted,
Okay.
I'm just making the last changes, and I know you're going away, so I got it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, Jack, that's a gorgeous list. And I'd like to stay focused in these last few moments that we're together in this round on that list. And if you would you just open up your heart a little bit, your memory a little bit of what brought you to form really the whole book, but particularly with a heart like that, like what you've just shared with us. What can
How many
you
minutes do we have?
say?
How many minutes do we have?
Well, I'm just thinking maybe, between 5 and 10 minutes, I'd like to wrap it up, but I'd love it if you would share a little bit about what did it take to have Jack Adam Weber come through life, and especially the recent chapters that you've been through, and to be expressing the way you're expressing and generate a list like that. Can you share with us some of that?
Yeah, what comes up for me, the first thing is the grief work that I did in my 20s. That's a pretty concise answer. I talked about that last time, and basically it was being humbled through grief work, through letting my heart break open and dealing with all the pain that I could find in my body over like a 3-year period. When I was fortunate enough to be able to afford psychotherapy at the time, and I was in there once a week, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week, and that went on for years. And I journaled. Most of my work during that time is like when I checked in with my therapist once a week. It was like it's just a synthesis of what I had been engaged with during that week. And so I went through a lot of that stuff just through my own journaling, through my own poetry, and then just, lying there, I'd lie still and feel my emotions and go through the process that I went through during that time. And I won't get too deep into it, but I think that's what did it. And then everything after that was just sort of, I think what I mentioned also, just sort of like an embellishment and different rounds of that. And I think certainly going through intense anxiety and depression a few years ago, talk about humbling, like I don't know anything more humbling than that.
Yeah.
And I almost died. So I don't have many words for that, except to say that these experiences have really consecrated my own humanness. And I don't even like to use the word spirituality very much, because I just think that our work is really to be human, and the more human we can be, the more earthy we can be.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a wonderful place to bring this particular episode of our conversation to a close. And for those who are tracking with us, we'll be doing the next couple of episodes in mid-July, and I'm going to be out of the country for the next couple of weeks. And so I look forward to getting back together with you, Jack, and I also look forward to really diving into the other disconnections, the disconnection with other people, Earth. And I know that we're going to find a couple more episodes. We've already mentioned one on doing a deep dive into self-regulation on the individual and the group level. And what I really want to just thank you for is taking the time with me to do this series and to share your remarkable work that you're putting out in your soon to be released book. I think this is an important time to be offering our gifts to the world, and I believe that both of us are doing that. But particularly, it's so obvious today, you're in your generous sharing of your gifts and your writing and your sharing of your own history. And it's just a real pleasure to be walking this path with you, Jack. This is what I think is meant by the number of times. I can't even count how many times it's been said that these are the times to find our people. And whether we live right next to each other or we live far apart, thank goodness for the moment we have this way of connecting. What's interesting, full disclosure, Jack and I have never met in person. So I feel very lucky to have you as a part of my life and as a co-creator on this path. And I look forward to next time, and I'll bring lots of stories from Greece, and I look forward to hearing what you've been.
All right, cool. I thank you, Dean. And for fuller disclosure, when you said, thank you for your time, to talk to me, I was thinking, it's like my pleasure, and I want to move in with you and have these discussions every night, until late in the night.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's kind of like a Shams and Rumi kind of a thing in a way. And it's just that pure spark of inspiration. And I could think of another, and I wanted to ask you at the end, I don't know if you have time or we have time, but maybe not, but you would ask me what inspired that list for me. And I wanted to ask you, if you share in any of those items in that list, what brought you to them? I don't know if we have time for that. Maybe not. We can catch it another time.
Yeah.
But maybe we can have another episode where you talk about your Greece experience.
Sure.
And like we can have a conversation that revolves around, everything that you're grokking with there, because you're going off to study with Jem, right?
Yeah.
Jem Bendel, and that's going to rock your world, man. You're going to be a madman out there.
Yeah. Well, I thank you for bringing that up, and I do want to postpone the deeper exploration that you were just asking for a later talk with.
Yeah.
have real time for it. But I would like to just grab a couple of moments to share about the Greece thing and Jim Bendel thing. So I am going to be going to a workshop that Jim Bendel and his partner Katie are putting on, and it's really all about the term he's coined of deep adaptation. And really, I think it's the most extraordinary kind of evolutionary moment where he stepped into the public sphere and he put out his first couple of papers, and they just went so instantly viral, including the words deep adaptation. And primarily what it's based on, and what's most exciting to me, is it's based on telling the truth, like the Extinction Rebellion we just talked about. The truth being, we are causing the collapse of Earth and human systems right now. And that's, in an odd way, that's extraordinarily inspiring to me. Because like the alcoholic or the addict, there is no hope of any change whatsoever until the truth gets told. So this is the first layer of that truth getting told, and it's very, very exciting. For those who haven't been, I haven't announced this much, but I'm a volunteer moderator on Jem Bendel's Deep Adaptation Forum online, which is something I would recommend everybody check out. And there are a number of subgroups in that forum, and I'm a moderator in the coaching and counseling subgroup. It'd be fun to have any of you all come on to there and join us in conversation on conversation threads, do some posting, join up, whatever feels right to you. And there are a number of subgroups. And in an odd way, that's on a slightly more global scale, and certainly a far larger scale than what you and I are doing here on this tiny podcast. The word is getting out, and the experience is resonating out. And so it's a time of immense excitement for me. So I will bring back, I believe, many precious gems from Greece, and I look forward to that. And I think this is a precious opportunity, as you were saying, in the midst of what might be some of our last moments of normalcy. And so let's grab this thing and let's produce a few more of these episodes of our special conversation.
Let's do a few hundred more. Yeah.
Are we good to go?
Yeah, we're good. And
okay.
have a great trip out there, Dean. I know you will. Be safe and let her fly.
All right.
Yeah.
Everybody, we'll be back with more episodes in mid-July, and leave lots of comments and subscribe to this Poetry of Predicament podcast, and we'll see you later.
Okay.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. You may want to check out our sister podcasts, the New Lifeboat Hour with Carolyn Baker on Podbean and at carolynbaker.net. Also, the Impossible Conversation podcast, another channel on YouTube. Thanks so much for joining us. Join us again later for another episode of the Poetry of Predicament.